Well, this is our last week in the Old Testament, so let's take a quick review of how Israel got to the time of Nehemiah. After the books of Nehemiah and Malachi, which were written about 400 years before Christ, God went silent in terms of the Bible for 400 years until the time of Christ. And as I'm sure you remember, God called Abraham to be the father of what would become the Jewish people. And his descendants ultimately ended up in Egypt, where they were made slaves. And then, of course, Moses led them out of that slavery. The generation of the Exodus wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and after which Joshua led the people into the promised land, and they divided and conquered. After that, they settled in various locations all throughout the promised land, and 8 judges ruled over the people until they asked/demanded a king, and then they got Saul. His successor was David, of course, the boy who killed a giant. And after the days of David and his son Solomon, the nation of Israel divided into 2, with Israel being the northern kingdom and Judah the southern. Both kingdoms, beginning first with Israel and then with Judah, eventually turned their backs on God, and they worshiped gods of fertility and war. And God had warned them in Deuteronomy 28 that discipline would come their way if that's what they did, and that's precisely what happened. In 722 BC, a nation to the north and northeast called Assyria conquered Israel, and the people of the northern kingdom were carried off into exile or killed, and they would never again rise as a nation. Then 136 years later, the southern kingdom, Judah, in 586 BC, was conquered by Babylon, which is modern-day Iraq, and they destroyed Solomon's temple and carried away thousands of the people into exile. 47 years later, Persia, or modern-day Iran, conquered Babylon and basically every other country in the Middle East, and the Persians allowed the Jews to go home in a series of waves. When they got home, they laid the foundation of the temple. Some prophets spoke to them to encourage them to finish, which they did, because the people needed payment for sin, and according to the Jewish religion at that time, they needed the sacrificial system, and in order to do the sacrificial system, they needed the temple. And now that many of the people were back in Judah and Jerusalem, and the temple had been rebuilt, what happens next? Well, Jerusalem needs to be rebuilt. The people were being besieged by guys we could compare to the mafia. And the impoverished Jews had no protection from these people. The soldiers had all been taken care of years ago, and there was no longer a soldier class. And this is where Nehemiah comes in. When he heard about what was going on in Jerusalem, his heart broke. And when he heard about how badly they were being mistreated. And so in the context of all of that, the book of Nehemiah tells the story of how that man attended to the plight of his people. The book will confront us, I think, with a few big questions. What is it that breaks your heart? What would you do for God if you could? And finally, what will you do when you're opposed? Nehemiah tells the story of a man who was faced with those questions. And they're important questions for us, especially in light of our cultural context. I think that all too often Christians live in a myopic way where we only see a limited view of God and what he wants to do in our lives. Some people don't believe that God has this great purpose for their lives, other than to just get married, have children, have a career. And so these people never really take the time to wonder about why God created them the way he did and what that creation leads to in terms of purpose for their lives. And in light of our current social upheaval, I think that this is a very good time for us to think about and explore what God would have us do. Now, as I've said many times before, if God has every hair on our head numbered, if he is sovereign over the affairs of mankind, if he gifts us with specific gifts and talents, and if he loves us in a more perfect way than even our human fathers do, then wouldn't it logically follow that he has plans for us? Maybe they're like a human father's plans, where he might not want to dictate just one course for his child to take, But like a human father, he certainly wants his children to do something that means something. When I look at my daughters, I don't want them to simply live, not having any kind of direction for their lives, not achieving anything that would make a mark on God's people. I want them to use their giftedness to achieve something that matters, something that God designed them for. I want them to have broken hearts that must do something that brings God glory. And that's exactly what happened to Nehemiah. We find him with his heart broken in verses 1-4 of chapter 1. Let's look at it. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month Chislev in the 20th year, while I was in Susa, the capital, that Hanani, one of my brothers, and some men from Judah came, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped and had survived the captivity, and about Jerusalem. They said to me, the remnant there in the province who survived the captivity are in great distress and reproach. And the wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. When I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days. And I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. Now Nehemiah lived in Susa, which was the Persian capital, and he is the Persian king sommelier, his cupbearer or wine tester. His job was to serve the king wine and make sure it wasn't poisoned. This was a very privileged position because he had direct access to the king. Only trusted people were allowed to get that close. And the book begins by telling us that Hanani, Nehemiah's brother, had visited Judah, and when he returned in the month of Chislev, which is November to December, probably in the year 446 BC, he brought back news from the people in Jerusalem that they were in great distress, that the city walls were broken down, so they had no defense against bandits, foreigners, and that the gates of the city, the places where you could control some access to the city, they were all burned with fire. And what was Nehemiah's response? Well, he broke down and wept for days. Now, you might wonder why did he react so strongly? I mean, he's probably lived his entire life in exile. All he has ever known is Babylon or Susa, Persia. And I think there are a couple possible explanations of why he reacted so strongly. First of all, he really did have a love for his people. He hated that they were suffering, or he was grieving over the discipline of God's people that was still going on. Just like Esther, his response to grief was fasting and prayer before God. And he did this, I think, for two reasons. First of all, he knew that he would go before the king eventually and make a big ask. And second, because he wants God to forgive and restore the people that he cares about, to deliver them from their enemies. So in his prayers, I believe he reminded God of his promise to restore the people if they return to him and keep his commandments. And obviously Nehemiah believes that the people are trying to follow God. But despite praying, he didn't do anything or ask anything of the Persian king for 3 to 4 months. Nehemiah 2, 1-5 tells us what happens when he finally summoned the chutzpah to make the big ask. Let's look at it. And it came about in the month Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, that wine was before him, and I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. So the king said to me, why is your face sad, though you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of heart. Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies desolate and its gates have been consumed by fire? Then the king said to me, well, what would you request? So I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said to the king, if it please the king and if your servant has found favor before you, send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. Now Nisan is the month in Israel of March to April. So it's been 3 to 4 months since he first got the news. He's been praying all that time. The king noticed that Nehemiah is depressed. And it frightens Nehemiah because if you remember from the book of Esther, the King Artaxerxes, had the ability to kill anyone for just about any offense. And in this case, spreading unhappiness before the king would be an offense. And so he knew that he could very easily lose his life over that. And verse 2 tells us that he was very afraid, but he didn't let his fear stop him. He told the king the reason for his sadness. He shut up a spontaneous prayer and asked the king to let him go to Judah, to Jerusalem, the city of his fathers, in order to rebuild it. Now, why would the Persian king allow this? Why would he allow a nation he conquered to rebuild and maybe become a real thorn in the flesh? I think a good clue is in the next verse, Nehemiah 2:6. Then the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, how long will your journey be and when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me, and I gave him a definite time. Now, what about this statement that Nehemiah obviously included for a reason? The queen was sitting beside him. Now, if you remember, Artaxerxes' queen was Esther. She was the one sitting beside him. The king was already sympathetic to the plight of the Jews. The book of Esther told us that he became furious when he discovered a plot to kill the people of his queen. So he was predisposed to act with kindness toward the Jews. So then Nehemiah gathers up the courage and makes the second part of the big ask in verses 7-8. The first part, of course, was, let me go to Judah and rebuild. Now here's the second part, verse 7. And I said to the king, if it please the king, let letters be given me for the governors of the provinces beyond the river, that they may allow me to pass through until I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress which is by the temple, for the wall of the city, and for the house to which I will go. And the king granted them to me because of the good hand of my God was on me. In these verses, we see that Nehemiah decided to go for the whole enchilada. Not only does he ask permission to go, but he asks for timber to be given from the king's forest in order to rebuild the gates of Jerusalem, and to help rebuild the wall, and to also build him a house for while he stays there. And Nehemiah attributes the king's approval to God's good hand being upon him. Now let's talk for a moment about where Nehemiah's boldness comes from. First, we need to acknowledge that spiritual boldness is not the absence of fear. Nehemiah said he was very afraid. Second, spiritual boldness is also not presumptive, meaning we don't just claim what we want from God and expect him to make it happen simply because we want him to make it happen. We're always subject to his will. Nehemiah was trusting in God's revealed word that God would restore the people, because God had promised that to the people of Israel. So therefore, he could have some level of confidence that God would be behind his plan. But the fact that he was afraid, the fact that he prayed and fasted for 3 to 4 months, the fact that he throws up a spontaneous prayer at the last second implies that Nehemiah wasn't demanding this from God, and there was a possibility that God could say no. We sometimes think that we know what God's will ought to be, and so we boldly pursue a course that we think God should bless, but we shouldn't do so with an arrogant spirit that says, God must do this for me, because we're always subject to God's will. The lesson here is this: God reserves the right to say yes or no, even when we think we know what his will is, and even when we have verses that we're quote unquote claiming. Now, coming back to Nehemiah, God, of course, said yes to his desire to do something for the people, his desire to be an instrument in God's hand to provide the physical security that the people needed. They were getting spiritual security in the sense that because they had rebuilt the temple, they were entering back into a right relationship with God. But now they also needed physical security, and that's where Nehemiah felt a burden to provide. And then it became personal. I must do something. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that there were 3 big questions that I wanted us to ask and think about in respect to this book. What is it that breaks your heart? What would you do for God if you could? And what will you do when you're opposed? It's time, I think, to think about the first one. What is it that breaks your heart? Nehemiah wept and wept for his defenseless people. Now let's think about this as though we were in the same context of Nehemiah. Can we put ourselves in his shoes? Let me give you a scenario. What if before you were born, the people of this church, your family, and other Christians were killed by the thousands by the million-man army of North Korea? And then the survivors were rounded up and carted off to serve as slaves in North Korea. And your grandparents were among those who were taken. And everyone was mistreated by their Korean masters. The years go on, and you end up being born over there. But China finally had enough of North Korea's nonsense, and they conquered North Korea, and they let those Americans who wanted to go home. But America is now in chaos. Gangs roam free, and they attack those who don't pay tributes and protection money. The people who return are in constant danger. They're struggling to grow anything at all to eat, and there's no one there to protect them. Some of your family decided to return to America, but your parents decided to make a life for themselves in China, and you end up moving to Beijing. You grew up there, and you'd been chosen to serve ultimately on the staff of the president of China. And word comes to you in Beijing of what's going on back in America. Your family returned, the people you care about, find themselves now in worse shape than when they were slaves. People are attacking them, they're cruelly exploiting them. How would you feel? What if it were your little sister or your grandmother back home that was being abused? Would it bother you? Well, of course it would. It would break your heart. And that explains why Nehemiah cried for days. That same scenario happened to him. A very mean country came in, conquered Judah, destroyed the temple, tore down the city walls. Thousands of your people were murdered in the streets. Other thousands were carted off to Babylon. And then another kingdom, more powerful than Babylon, arose and destroyed Babylon. And then they allowed the Jews to go home. But home wasn't so wonderful. So the question for us is, does anything break our hearts the way that Nehemiah's heart was broken? Does the thought of a loved one going to a Christless eternity bother you? Does the persecution of Christians around the world by radical Islamists make you want to weep? Does the moral decline of our country trouble you? The divisiveness of our country? The poverty in Mexico or India or Africa? Do you fear for America's children? Is there anything that you find intolerable? Which, of course, leads us into our second question. What would you do for God if you could? If you have discerned that your heart is broken for something, quite often that's God trying to get your attention to say, you need to do something about it. You need to make it personal. God, what am I supposed to do? Nehemiah looked at his grief and figured out that God was calling upon him to do something. This is part of how we discern God's will. If our heart breaks for something, then maybe God is calling upon us. Moses grieved over how his people were being treated in Egypt. David grieved over God being insulted by the Philistines, and so he took action against a giant of a man. And for me personally, I entered into full-time ministry because my heart just wouldn't rest. I had an entirely different career than ministry in mind when I first became a believer, but I burned. I burned to see God bring people into relationship with him because I had seen the difference in my life. I had seen how God saved me from myself, and I couldn't stand by and not tell people about it. And that passion wouldn't let me rest until I gave my life to that purpose. I pray that you have opened your heart to God, in a sense, for him to break it, to make it burdened to do something for him. But a heart that is so full of itself, always focused on itself, a heart that demands that it gets its own way, is too full to be spoken into by God. A heart that is arrogant and prideful, a heart that's unteachable, unapproachable, will not hear, will not find passion for the things of God. But Nehemiah's heart was broken, and so he heard. He heard what God was saying to him through his tears, and off he goes to Jerusalem, the king's wood in tow. And that brings us to our third question. What will you do when you're opposed? Because when Nehemiah got to Jerusalem, there was a number of people there who were invested in keeping the Jews weak. And they were not going to stand by and just let Nehemiah strengthen those people and give them a defense against them. Nehemiah 2, 13 to 20. So I went out at night by the valley gate in the direction of the dragon's well and onto the refuse gate, inspecting the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and its gates, which were consumed by fire. Then I passed on to the fountain gate in the king's pool, but there was no place for my mount to pass. So I went up at night by the ravine and inspected the wall. Then I entered the valley gate again and returned. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I had done, nor had I as yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or the rest who did the work. But then I said to them, you see the bad situation we are in, that Jerusalem is desolate and its gates burned by fire. Come, let us rebuild the walls of Jerusalem so that we will no longer be a reproach. I told them how the hand of my God had been favorable to me, and also about the king's words which he had spoken to me. Then they said, let us arise and build. So they put their hands to the good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official and Geshem the Arab heard it, they mocked us and despised us and said, what is this thing you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king? So I answered them and I said to them, the God of heaven will give us success. Therefore, we, his servants, will arise and build, but you have no portion, right, or memorial in Jerusalem. As soon as Nehemiah sets out to do something for God, it's opposed. Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, they rise up, they mock him in order to make him look foolish in the eyes of the Jewish people, in order to intimidate the Jewish people. Now, why would that be effective? Well, and why are these guys so against the Jews? Sanballat was a Horonite, which means he was from Samaria. And Samaria, if you remember, was the previous Israel. The people who were still living there were descendants of the Israelites, but they had turned their back on God. They did not want Jerusalem to regain its former power. Tobiah the Ammonite, he's from a land just east of the Jordan, and he was a wealthy businessman. And he had leased the temple storerooms in order to put his goods there. The priests, the people were so poor, they were starving to death. They, in effect, had to lease out the temple so that they would find something to, or have something to be able to buy food with. But by leasing out the temple storerooms, the priests weren't able to keep the offerings in there. They were preventing the Jews from worshiping the way that God had commanded. So Nehemiah unceremoniously throws Tobiah's stuff out on the street and clears out all those storerooms. Now Geshem the Arab, this was a powerful desert king, one of the bullies who profited from extortion of the Jews. He was the guy, like the Godfather, who was the protection guy. So together, these three guys realized that if Jerusalem rebuilds its city walls, if a leader comes in and unites the people, they're going to lose their money. It's always about money, isn't it? But it's also, they're going to lose their power over people. Together, all three of these guys were profiting from the weaknesses of the Jews. And so, obviously, they opposed Nehemiah. Now, is anything like that happening in America? Are there groups that do not want us to succeed as a nation? And are there groups who do not want Christians to regain the moral authority? Groups that don't like Christian stances on moral issues. Would they oppose Christians gaining followers and prominence in our society? You bet they would. But Nehemiah stands up to the enemy. But does opposition to God always stand down after one confrontation? Not normally. And so that's what happens here. Nehemiah chapter 3 describes all the work that the people did despite the threats of these three thugs. And then we see in chapter 4 that these three guys can't tolerate that anymore. They held off for a bit, and the people started rebuilding the walls, but now they're going to take action. Verse 1 of chapter 4. Now it came about that when Sanballat heard that they were rebuilding the wall, he became furious and very angry and mocked the Jews. He spoke in the presence of his brothers and the wealthy men of Samaria and said, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Are they going to restore it for themselves? Can they offer sacrifices? Can they finish in a day? Can they revive the stones from the dusty rubble, even the burned ones?" Now Tobiah the Ammonite was near him, and he said, "Even what they are building, if a fox should jump on it, he would break the stone wall down. Hear, O our God, how we are despised. Return the reproach on their own heads and give them up for plunder in the land of captivity. Do not forgive their iniquity, and let not their sin be blotted out before you, for they have demoralized the builders." So we built the wall, and the whole wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. Now when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the repair of the walls of Jerusalem went on, and that the breaches began to be closed, they were very angry. And all of them conspired together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause a disturbance in it. Sound familiar? But we prayed to our God, and because of them, we set up a guard against them day and night. Thus in Judah it was said, "The strength of the burden bearers is failing, yet there is much rubbish, and we ourselves are unable to rebuild the wall." Our enemies said, "They will not know or see until we come among them, kill them, and put a stop to the work." When the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times, "They will come up against us from every place where you may turn," then I stationed men in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, the exposed places, and I stationed the people in families with their swords, spears, and bows. When I saw their fear, I rose and spoke to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people. "Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses." When our enemies heard that it was known to us and that God had frustrated their plan, then all of us returned to the wall, each one to his work. From that day on, half of my servants carried on the work, while half of them held spears, the shields, the bows, and the breastplates. And the captains were behind the whole house of Judah. Those who were rebuilding the wall and those who carried burdens took their load with one hand doing the work and the other holding a weapon. It's amazing what these people did. When opposition to God arises, we need to be prepared to stand up for the things of God despite our fear, and do it as a lifestyle. The people worked with one hand while defending themselves with the other. This is particularly relevant to us. As our nation becomes more and more opposed to Christian morality, we're finding that opposition to us is on the rise. There's an organization based in Wisconsin that has been so opposed to Christianity in public spheres of life that they've been involved in many, many lawsuits, which include suing Congress for its invocations, meaning its opening prayers. They've sued towns for crosses in public parks, the IRS for allowing ministers to have housing allowances, a Texas sheriff for cross decals on police cars, a school for having a live nativity scene, and they sued a school board for having prayer at their meetings. And that's just a small number of the suits they've filed. There was a lawsuit in federal court in Michigan not that long ago in which a man sued 2 Christian Bible publishers because their versions of the Bible referred to his lifestyle as a sin. He said that violated his constitutional rights and have caused him emotional pain and mental instability. And he sought $60 million from Zondervan and $10 million from Thomas Nelson Publishing. In the story of Nehemiah, the people were assigned to rebuild the wall right in front of their own homes. That's where our assignment begins as well. We do God's will, maybe something that we're uncomfortable doing, but we know we should do it right where we live. In our homes, in our schools, in our church, in our community, and in our nation. So as we close the pages now of the Old Testament, let's remember that the Old Testament had a running thread. It's about the cost of sin. In the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve sinned, the first thing God did was slay an animal to cover their sins. The cost of sin, or the rejection of God, is a kind of death because it separates us from him. And therefore, to reverse it, a death had to occur. The blood of an innocent had to be shed in order to cover sin. As a result, God established a sacrificial system. But the death of an animal could only pay for sin temporarily. The sacrifice of an animal did not equate to the total cost of human sin. Therefore, a human death ultimately had to take place. But humans are sinful, and therefore a human death, even the best human death, couldn't come up to the level of goodness that would be the counterpart to the wickedness of sin. We needed a perfect human to provide that sacrifice. A new Passover lamb, Jesus. And he would permanently cover our sin. And that brings us to the New Testament, which we'll begin looking at next week. Let's pray. So, Father, we're hearing the clarion call to action. We're hearing a call in which we're burdened for our country, we're burdened for our church, we're burdened for Christians, we're burdened for the morality of our nation, we're burdened for America's children and the future. We're burdened about disease. We're carrying all these burdens, and we're somewhat downtrodden, I think, as a result, God. So in a real sense, we're like the people of Jerusalem when they returned after the captivity. We need someone, your son, to remind us that we can do anything through you, to rebuild our nation, to rebuild our faith, to make an impact in our own homes and in our neighborhoods and in our community and in our world. But we know that none of that can happen unless the good hand of you is upon us. And that's what we ask. We don't want to quit. We don't want to give up hope. We want to see you affect change through us. So enable us. Give us your grace. And we ask all of this in your Son's name. Amen.